It's not often, even as someone that prosecutes murders for a living, that I come across somebody that is just plain evil. He just seemed so over the top and outrageous, it was kind of hard to believe there were people like this that truly existed. I've never been in a courtroom with a defendant before, where I can just somehow feel the evil that's in the room, like I could with Osuna. That has never happened to me in another case, and I've been doing this for a while now. These are the words of prosecutor Nick Lackey, the man tasked with dealing with the case at hand, speaking with reporter Olivia Lavois. And as you can tell by his description, this case and its subject, Jaime Osuna, are quite unusual. Olivia's podcast, A Man with a Thousand Faces, was a massive source for this video. Within that podcast, she has a lot of first-hand information, interviews, and such, and so if you find this video interesting, I highly suggest you go and check that out as well. Now, it may seem from the description that the prosecutor gives that he was literally taking the devil incarnate to court. But this description does not only come from Osuna's aura that some have suggested he gives off when in his presence, but also from his appearance. With a face filled with Joker-esque tattoos and sporting a pentagram on his forehead, he seems to be trying to exude intimidation with his appearance. And I would say if that was his goal, he has accomplished it. Hello, and welcome to A Walk in the Dark. I'm your host, Justin. Now, there are many cases, mysteries, what have you, that catch my attention, but few have really captured me with such a deep fascination as this story. And so when trying to decide what my debut video should be for this channel, it was really a no-brainer. It had to be Jaime Osuna. Part of the reason for that is, in a space that's filled with stories of killers and people that lived with them and observed them and saying things like, well, you never would have known. And this individual, they were so charming and they seemed so normal, so ordinary. It took me aback a little bit to hear the description of Osuna like, No, he feels like a killer. Now, Jaime is known for two different nicknames. He's of course known as the Man with a Thousand Faces, but he's also known as the real-life Joker. Now, the Joker nickname comes from, of course, his Joker-esque tattoos. He's got the ink around his mouth to create that Joker-like smile. He's also got Joker-like or clown-like makeup around his eyes. And he reportedly had just a general obsession with the character. He would quote the character in menacing ways, as we'll hear about later on. Just a very big fan. Now, the Man with a Thousand Faces nickname comes from two different places. One is the idea that every time the needle touched his skin, he was receiving another face. Whether that was actually 1,000 in total or not is improbable. The other reason for this nickname is far more gruesome, and it will be made apparent later in the video. And before you ask, no, this is not some Ed Gein Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of stuff, but it's still pretty bad. Speaking of gruesome, the subject matter of this video is going to be quite graphic, and so if this is not the sort of thing that you are interested in, although I'm assuming it is if you clicked on the video, then this is a good time to tell you viewer discretion is advised, and if you do not want to see this sort of subject matter, then I would advise clicking off now. If not, then let's proceed with the case. Well, before we proceed with the case, I do want to take this opportunity to thank you for watching. Now, let's get into it. Jaime's story begins in Bakersfield, Kern County, California, where he was born to his mother, Michelle, and to a father, the name of whom I cannot seem to find. Though the name of his father seems to be unknown, we have some details as to what life was like between father and mother. Jaime did not have it easy growing up, which is often the case for people like this. However, it's important to note that while many killers had hard upbringings, most people that had hard upbringings do not become killers. According to forensic psychologist Chris Mahandi, when discussing nature versus nurture, he had this to say: "The truth is, in most cases, it's a mix of the environment intersecting with some biological predispositions." Or to sum it up another way, he has this to say: "Some criminals are made, some are born. But most, it's a combination, and all make choices." Jamie's abuse began before he was even born. His father had kicked Michelle, his mother, in the stomach, hurting the unborn Jamie while still in the womb. This reportedly caused a little dent in the earlobe of one of his ears, though this is hard to see from his pictures. Because of the location of this injury, this could explain some interesting anomalies with Jamie's psyche that we will hear about later on, so take a mental note of this. Jamie's mother left his father while he was still an infant, but that was not the end of the terror for little Osuna, as his stepfather, Jeff, whom his mother married when Jamie was about 1 year old, was not an upgrade. Jamie would suffer abuses such as being withheld food while Jeff made him watch the other kids eat. Then when Jeff finally allowed Jamie to eat, he would put his plate on the floor and made him eat it like a dog, a degrading and heartbreaking scenario. Jeff hated his stepchildren, but absolutely loved the children he would later have with his wife. The psychological torment of seeing unconditional love being shown to other kids while only hatred is shown to him must have been quite damaging to young Osuna. But it wasn't enough for Jeff to simply mistreat Jamie himself. It would also irritate and infuriate him when his mother would show him affection. He would actively attempt to keep his mother from showing him affection, and unfortunately, she would oblige to this desire of his and only show that affection, giving him hugs in secret. As you can imagine, this would cause a negative association in Jamie's young and developing mind with unconditional love and affection. Those things were treated as though they were a taboo thing. It was a thing to be hidden and ashamed of in the Osuna household. On another occasion, Jamie's stepfather apparently became so upset with him that he pushed him out of the moving car while still in his car seat. According to his mother, it landed upright and Jamie was okay, but he almost got hit by a truck in this process. She was able to retrieve him, jumping out of the car to go back, but Jeff did not allow them to go to the doctor, so it is unknown to what extent this event may have also contributed to Jamie's health in the long run. And I think we can safely say we've all been there, am I right? You know what I'm saying? We've all been pushed out of a moving car by our stepdad. No, me neither. Closest experience I've probably had to anything like this is my mother almost killing us in a fiery explosion while trying to avoid squirrels on the road, but that never happened, so praise God. On another occasion, Jamie was tied to a tree and whipped mercilessly with a belt, and on yet another occasion, a brick was thrown at him by his uncle. And another time, he forced Jamie outside in the cold rain, and as the child began to beat upon the door and beg for salvation to be let back inside, his father's reaction from the upstairs bathroom was simply to slam the window shut with such force and anger that it shattered the window, sending a cascade of dangerous, sharp glass down upon the child, which cut him so severely that he needed to go to the hospital and get stitches. I think you're starting to get the idea. Jamie's childhood was not the bed of nostalgic roses that many of us were fortunate enough to grow up with. Instead, it was more like a bed of spikes or hot coals. It was nothing to look back on fondly, that is to be sure. But Jeff did not keep the abuse to Jamie alone, even though he did seem to be Jeff's favorite target. He also abused his other stepson, Jamie's older brother. However, this would not last long. After Jeff threw a fork at this child, which did puncture him, he moved in with his grandparents. Jamie, however, would not be allowed to do the same. According to family, his grandfather had an inexplicable hatred for him. Yes, hatred for a child. And so as Jamie watched his brother pull away to greener pastures, he was stuck with his vicious stepfather and the mother who refused to protect him, a mother that was, just like Jamie, a victim. Jamie, according to his mother, would pray to be saved from this living hell, but the answer would not come, at least not for some time. Divine intervention seemed to step in once he was a preteen. when he was finally allowed to go to his grandparents' house. But unfortunately, according to his mother, the damage had already been done by this point. The young boy who was once said to be a caring and loving child had now become cold and unfeeling. The brutal life he lived had already changed him, so much so in fact that the young Osuna had already stabbed another boy by age 15, spending some time in juvie as a result. Unfortunately, the now teenage Jaime would not learn from his time in juvie, and would in fact go on to destroy his life and the lives of at least 2 others. But before we get to that, let's look at Jaime's married life. That's right, Jaime Osuna, already stabbing people by the age of 15. He was able to get himself a nice young lady, so you can too. I can too. Okay, let's get back to this. Nope. No, I'm sad now. And we're back. On November 13th, 2011, in Bakersfield, California, the police received a phone call from an employee at the El Morocco Hotel about a body that was found in one of the rooms. The details of this, Osuna's first confirmed murder, will come later. But it's important to note that this call was not the first the police received concerning the body. The first call, in fact, came from none other than the killer's very own wife, who will remain nameless throughout this video. Just prior to this phone call to the police, Osuna had called his wife and said that he had murdered somebody in this very hotel. He even gave the name of the hotel. And so, as the wife called the police, she had pretty good information that this had taken place. She reportedly told them that he was, quote, psycho, and obviously implied that he was quite capable of doing something like this. His wife said to the police, "I'm concerned that somebody could be there, suffering. Has anybody called about a body or a murder at this motel?" To which the police responded with a no, and unfortunately, they did not seem to take the call very seriously. At least that's what reports say. That is why the police needed an employee at the motel to find the body and call in at that point. Unfortunately, Jaime's wife was correct. A woman had been suffering, and somebody had been murdered at that motel, but thankfully, she was wrong in that Yvette Pena was not suffering anymore. But the question remains, how exactly did this woman reach the point that she is receiving calls from an absolute maniac, a maniac that she married and had a child with? I think we can all agree this is a fairly unusual family dynamic. You may be surprised to find that Jaime and his wife's relationship started in almost as bizarre of circumstances as it ended, and also with violence. Well, that's not immediately true. It actually really starts with fun, with a party. Osuna met his wife at a party that was being held at her house. The event was put on by her son, but she decided to be the, quote, cool mom and join in with the festivities. Now, at this time, she was 37, while Jaime was 20. So how did this disturbed young adult make an impression upon this older woman who was described in the Man with 1,000 Faces podcast as being quite beautiful? Well, he grabbed a knife and stabbed a guy she was dancing with. That's right, folks. Osuna saw something he wanted and he just had to have it, so he didn't take any risks. He didn't try something new. No, he did what he does best. Stab people. That's right, folks, the good old-fashioned psychopath riz. It works every single time. Okay, look, it may have been a bold move on his part, but listen. You gotta go big or go home, am I right? Come on. If you're not willing to take risks, you will never make it anywhere in life. And listen, first impressions are everything. And while this big move did get him put in the big house for a while, thankfully the wound on the young man was superficial and somehow actually worked at getting his foot in the door to start talking with the hostess of the aforementioned house party from behind bars. Yeah. And just one more time, I don't want to belabor the point. If Mr. Stabby Man can do it, you can do it, and I can do it. Because we're not stabbing people. Jamie's new pen pal described him as being a gentleman and an intellectual, discussing subjects such as philosophy and psychology. Also, that he was charming and respectful. Obviously, excluding his propensity to stab random partygoers. Now, when I think of the great thinkers and philosophers of the past, Jaime Osuna doesn't really fit into that mold, but, what do I know, right? I'm just a stupid YouTuber. Despite these qualities this outside-looking-in partner said Osuna had, she claimed not to see it turning into anything serious, though she did appreciate the attention and found it flattering. She would eventually agree to give him a ride after he was out of jail, which led to a night together in a local motel. Her intention was for a one-night stand, but Jamie managed to make another shocking impression on her by getting her pregnant. All I can say is, my friends, save yourself for marriage, and then you definitely won't end up having one-night stands with convicts. Okay, so it's not the only way to avoid being impregnated by a violent convict, but it is a way. Interestingly, though, Jamie was ecstatic about this turn of events. He was excited to be a dad and convinced the new mother to allow him to live with her and help take care of the baby like a big happy family. She obliged, obviously realizing the help would be a huge benefit to both herself and the new child coming into the world. Now, it's hard to say to what extent Jamie's excitement about being a new father and husband was real or an illusion. After all, who on this earth can truly know the thoughts and intents of another outside of God himself? However, if he was playing it up, he was doing a really good job at it. His ex-wife expressed his tendency to put on a facade by saying, quote, he can mimic being a really good person, unquote, which was perhaps a skill he picked up when studying psychology, or perhaps it came more naturally to him. It is a known tendency within people that show signs of psychopathy or other associated conditions that they can be very manipulative. And that said manipulation can often come off as seemingly socially skilled or even charming. Sadly, it didn't take long for the darkness on the inside to be manifest on the outside and for this facade to fall apart. Just like his stepfather before him, he began to abuse the one that he claimed to love. On one occasion, he actually stole her mother's ashes and ran off with them somewhere. We're not sure where. They were never seen again or found. Now, he did actually go to jail for this. But sadly, after Osuna had gotten out of jail, this is when he began using methamphetamines and reportedly became far more violent, starting to abuse her children as well. Now, she did not take this lying down, however, unlike Jamie's mother, and she threatened him with knives, to which he responded by leaving the house. A sensible decision. And then being arrested on a parole violation when he attempted to return. Upon his release, he escalated to threatening death towards her and her children. He would stalk them and lurch around their house, but always leave before the police would arrive. Bravery at its finest. Now, it was about a week after this last release from jail, because at this point he's been put in jail and released so many different times, it's hard to keep track of, but the most recent time was about a week that had passed when we had that infamous phone call that we opened up this section of the video with, in which Jamie tells his wife that he killed somebody at the El Morocco Hotel. When a body was, in fact, found there, the police questioned him, of course, to which he begins to just go off on all of this stuff about his wife and just saying different things. Well, at first, the police were kind of like, this has nothing to do with anything, we're not talking about your wife right now, but he just kept going back on and on and on that subject, and so finally they decided to just play along. At this point, Jamie was denying any involvement in the murder of Pena. He claimed to have simply said that he murdered somebody at the hotel where a body was in fact found, just to scare his wife. However, it is noted that Pena bore a shocking resemblance to Jamie's wife, suggesting that to Jamie, Pena may have been nothing more than a vessel for him to take out the rage that had been building up within him, making the murder of Pena a tragic case of wrong place, wrong time. His wife's resemblance to the victim is also a chilling reminder that she likely just narrowly escaped a similar fate. Who knows what would have happened if Jamie had not been apprehended as quickly as he was due to his sloppy handling of the crime scene and the situation, and, of course, literally calling and confessing to the crime to said wife. In my extremely amateur opinion, if he had not been found as quickly as he was, Jamie's wife would not have been alive to tell her story. However, even after being incarcerated, again, Jamie did not cease to be a menace to his wife. He would harass her from jail by calling CPS multiple times, trying to get her children taken away. He also reportedly mailed her a dead rat. It was supposedly crushed inside of an envelope. He passed around a letter in hopes that someone would burn down her house and kill her, etc. To close out this section of the video, I do want to discuss a story that Jamie's wife talked about in the documentary that I've been referencing multiple times here, A Man with a Thousand Faces. Olivia LaVoice discusses something that Jamie's wife says. Now, she emphasizes, and so will I, that there isn't a lot of corroborating evidence that this took place, but Jamie's wife did say it, and so I want to discuss it here. At one point, Jamie's wife had been picked up on unrelated charges to any of this stuff. She ended up in a transportation vehicle to be taken, I think it was from one jail to another, or perhaps it was being taken to jail, I can't remember which. But either way, she was being transported by the police in one of these vehicles. And supposedly, she was in this vehicle with another inmate, of course, several different inmates, and Jamie, for some reason, was in the same vehicle, and he said something like, yeah, now, get her, right? Like as if Jamie was giving a signal to this other inmate to, attack Jamie's wife, to which she did, and started beating up Jamie's wife, and she was screaming and yelling for help. The vehicle then pulled over, and it seems, again, from Jamie's wife's account, that they didn't really believe her, and so that may or may not have happened, but there it is. Interesting nonetheless. So we've talked about Jamie, we've talked about his wife, we've talked about his upbringing, we've talked about his parents. Now it's time to talk about the people whose lives he took. In this section, we will discuss the life and death of Yvette Pena. Yvette Pena was a 36-year-old mother of 6 who was loved dearly by her family, her sister in particular. When she was tragically found dead in the aforementioned El Morocco Hotel on November 13th, 2011, it changed the lives of everyone associated with her in a profound way. The loss of a loved one is always difficult to come to terms with, but the circumstances of Yvette's death made it all the more difficult to stomach. When she was found, it was clear her murderer was demented. She was discovered with knives and scissors in her back and gagged. When Pena's sister attempted to see her, she was told the severity of the body's condition, both due to the attack and the state of decomposition, was such that it was simply impossible. She asked if she could at least have a lock of Yvette's hair, desiring to at least have something to hold on to from her beloved family member. But they said there was simply too much blood for that to be possible. The scene was truly gruesome. Now, the El Morocco Hotel was known for being a cesspool for illegal activity, prostitution, drug use, and drug dealing. So you may be asking yourself, how exactly did this beloved mother of 6 find herself in such a place? Well, the sad reality is her suffering did not begin in that motel room. It began way back when she was 10 years old, and it never really stopped, all the way up until the end. Yvette's sister recalled in an interview how she had suffered SA at the hands of their mother's boyfriend when she was just a child. As a child herself, her sister relied upon special machines to keep her alive, and this boyfriend was the only way they could afford this expensive care. He threatened to withdraw that support if Pena ever said anything, and he also threatened to hurt her sister in the same way he was hurting her if she said anything. And so she decided not to say anything, believing that enduring the abuse would protect her sister. But tragically, it was found later through examination that her sister had been abused as well. It is impossible to understand how this must have made Yvette feel. For years, she endured this suffering, all the while believing it was for a greater cause. That belief is likely what kept her going during this difficult time. It is always more bearable when we can assign some kind of higher purpose or meaning to our suffering. And I believe that for her, protecting her sister was the higher purpose for her suffering. But now, not only had her innocence been taken, but the purpose behind it being taken. In the mind of her abuser, Yvette was simply an object to fulfill his sick desires. But in the mind of Pena, she was making a willing sacrifice. She was able to take control in a situation where she felt powerless by framing it as a sacrifice. But now even that had been taken. This was no doubt a horrific tragedy. Unfortunately, Yvette felt responsible, believing that if she had spoken up sooner, perhaps the abuse would not have happened to her little sister. But of course, as we know, being a child herself, she bore no responsibility for that. This devastation would eventually lead to her going down a dark road of drug abuse and possibly prostitution. She would eventually leave the family home at the age of 16, fostering a resentment towards her mother for, from her perspective, allowing this abuse to occur. Pena reportedly loved being a mother and ended up having more children later on. She did better with her vices at this point, trying her best to be the greatest version of herself she could be for her kids, though she still was not totally clean. Unfortunately, by 2004, she began taking harder drugs, things like meth. She began to grow cold at this point, or, as her sister says, she just stopped caring. As a result of this, her children at the time were all taken. Her next child was taken upon birth, and upon unsuccessfully attempting to get her sixth child back, she gave up and moved into the El Morocco Hotel, where her body would eventually be found. A tragic life from start to finish. This loss hit the Pena family hard, but their suffering, unfortunately, was only beginning. Yvette's sister recalls when it was time to work through the legal proceedings, and she was asked to look at the crime scene photos. She did not want to, but she felt that if her sister had to actually endure the horrific murder, then the least she could do was look at the photos. But she had no idea how gruesome this murder really was. She said that she could not even tell what was going on in the picture. She could not recognize what she was looking at in this photo that was supposedly that of her own sister. What was once the physical form of her sister she loved so dearly simply looked like ground burger meat, according to her. Osuna had taken her life and had mutilated her to the point of taking her humanity as well. She correctly decided that Pena would not have wanted her to view those photos or to go through what she was going through. But if the road ahead was to include court, unfortunately she and her family and everybody present would have to endure much more than just photographs, but graphic details of every single thing that took place during that murder. But thankfully, this would not be allowed to happen. And in a shocking turn of events, Jaime Osuna himself would be the one to stop it from happening. Now, why? Was the real-life Joker having a rare Batman-esque protagonist moment? No. He wanted to make sure everyone knew he was not doing this because he cared when he said, quote, "I don't have no sympathy. I'm sadistic. I really don't care. I'll do it, and I'll do it again, over and over and over," unquote, to Olivia LaVoice in an interview. He wanted to plead guilty because he was supposedly done being part of the system, man. He just wanted to go to prison and be done with it. And so he took a plea deal, as these brave murderers often do. He'll spare the family the gruesome details of a trial, spare himself the death penalty, and live out his days in prison without the possibility of parole. During the short time that Osuna was in court, he tried to portray himself like the cartoonish evil villain he admired so much. He displayed horrific, mocking behavior towards the victims, making a blah 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 hand motion towards them while they talked. He smiled and waved at the victims and rolled his eyes, making a mockery of the entire situation. At one point during his interview with LaVoice, Jaime waxes philosophical and says he's not a monster, but rather he's self-made, and he's proud of it. Now, when most people say they're self-made, they attach something meaningful to the phrase. I'm a self-made millionaire, a self-made philanthropist, a self-made author. They attach something to it that is not only impressive and difficult to achieve on your own, but also contributes something to broader society. You made yourself, but not solely for yourself. You have dug and scratched your way to the higher order of societal function, which will typically translate to some sort of gain for broader society. But what did Jaime do? He tortured and killed a woman in a motel room. Good job, Jaime. You're a self-made sadistic loser. We're all very proud of you. I mean, seriously, what do you want a medal? I mean, you murdered somebody. You're like the bottom of the barrel of society. Like anywhere you go, that would be like the bottom. I mean, like I could just say, oh, I'm a self-made basement dweller. But because I put self-made in front of it, that makes it sound impressive, I guess. Psycho logic. The absolute senselessness of this crime is emphasized in this heartbreaking quote from Peña's daughter. For no reason. She did not even do anything. It was just because he was evil and he just wanted to kill her. Because he had the chance. In an interview with LaVoice, she then goes on to name several important life events that her mother was not there for. The pain in her voice is hard to listen to as she closes out these losses with, "Not because she didn't want to be there, but because he took her from me. And it was all because he just felt like it." But for us to hear this is not nearly as hard as the pain she and the rest of her family have endured as a result of Yvette Peña's loss. It's clear to see she was loved, and Osuna not only ripped that love out of her life, but he did it for no real reason, and he did it with a smile. Well, fantastic. The Joker's not laughing no more. He's behind bars. His reign of terror is over. Right? Yeah, why are you giving a dramatic pause and then saying, right? Of course it's right. Right? He can't. People, come on. Nobody kills people in prison. Ooh. No, unfortunately, this story is not over, as you can probably tell by the length of the video. And if you recall, there are many aspects to the video that I was talking about earlier that, hey, there's more details to this thing and that thing and the other that we have not covered. So, the show goes on. Jaime would take the life of one more person while in prison, and the circumstances of his death are so gruesome, it's hard to believe that this is even real. I mean, to put this in perspective, when I was doing research for this video and I came across this section and heard the details, it literally comes off like one of those sections in a slasher movie where it's like, okay, this section, this part, this is a little over the top. This wouldn't actually happen ever. And yet here it is, happening. Jamie's next victim, Luis Romero, was in prison for shooting and killing a woman who was reportedly associated with a rival gang to the one Romero himself was a part of in Los Angeles. He had been moved to the maximum security section of the prison called the Shoe, where Osuna was living. However, it is unknown as to why Romero was moved to this section. Now, here's the thing. Prison inmates killing each other is not a super unusual occurrence. It doesn't necessarily happen every single day, but it's also not the sort of thing that makes front page news. But by this point in the video, I'm sure you know who we're dealing with. And so you probably also know this was not a normal murder, if murder can be normal. Remember that content warning at the beginning of the video? Well, this is the section where that's really gonna kick in. Jamie did not just shank his cellmate or smother him with a pillow or other killing methods that are typical of prison murders. No, Jamie, using a simple razor blade and some string, cut off one of his fingers, removed pieces of the man's lung, removed entire ribs with a razor, cut a Joker's smile into the man's face, removed an eye, and beheaded him. Again, and I can't emphasize this enough, with a razor blade and some string. In one account, an inmate speaking on this particular murder rightfully talks about how he goes, look, do you know how difficult it is to dismember a human body? And to do that with such a small instrument? And in the middle of a prison? To do that with an instrument like this, it's just astonishing. Tragically, one source said that Romero would likely have been alive for much of this tormentuous experience, which definitely matches Osuna's stated thrill in torture. In keeping with his theme of absolute depravity and pure, unadulterated evil, he discusses in an interview the joy he gets from killing, how the torture aspect in particular gives him a rush more potent than any drug or any intimate encounter with a woman. A truly chilling and sick outlook. But Jamie was not done yet. He proceeded to cover the walls, writing in blood things like, "Ha ha ha ha. I am a man with 1,000 faces. I am not mad. I'm just differently sane." And then, most fitting of all, he simply writes the word freak. Then, possibly the most chilling of all of his decisions, he hung some of his victims' intestines from a light fixture in the cell, made a necklace out of some of his organs with some string, and according to one of the prison guards, made a sandwich with parts of the victim, which was partially eaten. Yeah. I do want to note here that Jamie's defense team had him looked at by a doctor to see if perhaps that time that he fell out of the car when he was a child could have damaged his brain physically, and they did in fact find that that was the case. However, to what extent or how this may have affected his psyche is unknown. So by this point, you're probably asking yourself, how on earth did this monster commit such acts without anybody noticing? How did the guards within a maximum security section of a high security prison not hear any of this happening, especially if the report that the victim would be alive for most of it is to be believed? Well, it turns out everybody else is asking the same question, and even more still. According to various sources that know how this prison works, some of whom were actually inmates there, the guards did cell checks every 15 to 30 minutes. There is absolutely no way Osuna did all of this in 30 minutes, probably not even in 2 hours. Even if he had the proper tools for such surgical endeavors, it would take quite a while to achieve this level of dismemberment, let alone the macabre art display that followed. But before we can even reach the point that we're asking these sorts of questions, we have to ask the original question that makes these possible, which is, why on earth did they give somebody like Osuna a cellmate to begin with? It is my understanding that this wing of the prison is exclusively for extremely violent criminals, which our subject definitely is one of those, and they don't typically get cellies for that reason. Well, who likes a good conspiracy theory? Some suggest the guards deliberately placed Romero in the cell in hopes that he would beat up Osuna, as he was generally disliked among inmates and prison staff alike. And no wonder, as he would throw bodily fluids at the guards and taunt them on a regular basis, and he was considered a weird freak to the other inmates, especially after they found out the details of his first murder. They did not realize right away that he had tortured and killed a woman. They only knew he was in for murder. Upon learning these details, he was shunned among the community. It could be that, or it could simply be the results of overpopulation forcing the prison's hand to put cellmates together that ordinarily would not be put together. We really can't say which. However, it is worth noting that this particular prison has a dark past and has been known to allow, let's say, non-PC behavior and treatment from behind its walls in the past. But they say that this is all in the past, and that does seem to be the case by many reports. But unfortunately, once you build a reputation like that, it does cause people to say things like, well, they did it before, what's to stop them from doing it again? But setting that issue aside for a moment, we need to get back to what we were talking about before, that even after having received a cellmate, there is no way he should have been able to take that much time to fulfill his dark, sick fantasies without anybody noticing or anybody checking on the cell. And again, from a report of an individual that went to this prison before, they're not allowed to cover their windows. Apparently, the guards are supposed to be able to look in there at any time. So with a transparent window that's supposed to see into the cell, all of this is going on. So you've got the, no doubt, screaming going on, and you've got the visuals through a window, and nobody notices that this is happening. It's just outlandish. But here on the Walk in the Dark show, we always want to give honor to the victims. And Luis is no different. Yes, Luis was in prison for murder and was part of a violent gang, so it's easy to just write him off. However, it's important to note that nobody deserves for something like this to happen to them, no matter what they have done. But also, Romero had reportedly found the Lord while behind bars, and according to his family, had truly turned over a new leaf. His conversion seemed to be genuine. To add to the tragic nature of his death, he was also set to be paroled soon. This story leaves me wondering if Luis Romero had been given the chance that he should have had, his second chance at life, what could his future have looked like? Unfortunately, now we'll never know, because that opportunity was taken from him, an opportunity that God had given him, and that only God had the right to take. But even if you don't buy this conversion story, and fair enough, there have been many in the past that have claimed to have found the Lord, and it turned out not to be the case. And we don't really have that much information. Even if you don't buy it, that's fair enough. He still leaves behind a family that loved him, regardless of his flaws, regardless of his actions. And it must be terrible to be left with the memories of what happened to this man, to know that somebody you loved went out like he did. Now, that closes the book on Jaime's confirmed murders. However, unfortunately, it is possible that he has committed more murders that we are not aware of yet. Jaime claims to have committed 2 other murders in his interview with LaVoice. In this interview, she prods him periodically for details about these supposed murders, but he does not give her much to work with. He seems to think that holding on to this secret will help mitigate the emptiness inside of him as a result of being locked up, and he also suggests he wants to keep it secret so he can have some sort of leverage, but I'm not sure what for. He's already escaped the death penalty and is serving life without the possibility of parole, and I doubt, after what he did to Romero, they'll give him a deal in exchange for information on cold cases, but then again, crazier things have happened. He does tell her that he committed his first murder when he was 13 against a 27-year-old, and that this was done with the help of a mentor who, quote, believed like he believed, unquote, presumably referring to his self-proclaimed belief in Satanism. The second alleged murder was in 2007, and the victim was allegedly a 32-year-old woman. He gave various details beyond this, none of which have ever materialized into anything concrete. Unfortunately, the area where Osuna lived is a violent place, with murder being a relatively normal occurrence, so it's possible that he's telling the truth and the bodies have just never been found, or they've been found but just have not been tied to him. But the question is, if this is the case, how could such an unhinged, sloppy killer who left his fingerprints, a gigantic mess, his DNA, all over the crime scene of Yvette Pena, how could he have been getting away with murders from way back when he was 13 years old? Well, Jaime was asked this in an interview, and he had a response. He claims to know how to kill without leaving behind evidence, but chose to be sloppy with Pena because he wanted to be caught. There's no real way to know if his claims are true, but after learning what this man is capable of, it would not be surprising at all. In fact, I think it might be more surprising if he hasn't killed more people. Jaime Osuna, the man with a 9th grade education, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and with an unremarkable physical presence, standing at a measly 5'6" and 120 pounds. The so-called real-life Joker, and the man with 1,000 faces. If not for his tattoos, his physical appearance would not be much to look at. Yet, brooding inside this small man was a monster, an evil force of destruction that sought simply to satisfy its urges, to cause as much pain as possible, both to his victims and their families. What can be learned from this story? Well, one may seek to excuse Osuna because of his rough upbringing, but as we saw in Yvette Pena's story, she had it just as rough, if not worse. She was abused from the age of 10 to 12 to protect her sister, only to realize that it didn't even work. She then went on to try and find love through having children and self-medicated with drugs, but ultimately her bad medicine ended up taking her whole purpose away from her. She had hit rock bottom, and there waiting for her was her worst nightmare. Her tragedy did not make her into a killer, just like most people's hard lives do not make them killers. Jaime chose to do what he did, and that's all there is to it. I believe there is good in the world. I believe God is at work in people's lives, but I also believe he allows us to make choices and face the consequences of those choices. And sometimes, our actions have consequences for others, and not just ourselves. There is light, but there is also darkness. I believe we are fooling ourselves if we do not, at least occasionally, make ourselves aware of that darkness. Because when we do, we will find that no matter how deep the darkness gets, and this case is definitely on the deeper side, the light is always stronger. And on that note, thank you again for watching. This was my first ever video like this, and so I hope you can forgive any rookie mistakes that I'm not yet aware I've made, and I hope that the video added some degree of value to your life. I would hate to have wasted your time. Speaking of time, I grossly underestimated the amount of time and effort that goes into making something like this. So, if you liked the video, a like, comment, subscribe, any kind of engagement will help make it all worth it. If you didn't like the video, I'm sorry. I look forward to putting out more content like this for you all. And before I go, remember, you can take a walk in the dark, but always live in the light. God bless.